Hello, I think we're live. Alright, for the win here again, I am on Desolation B3A Bug Fix, I like that last title, by Maya Mogus. I hope I pronounced that right. I was going to leave feedback on this map, draw a bunch of pictures, sketch a bunch of things, write a lot of thoughts out, but then I realized it would probably take like 3 hours, and maybe doing it this way, it'll only take like 1.5 maybe. So I'm going to run through a bunch of things. Unfortunately, I did not structure them well enough that I can give you my best thoughts first. It's just me sequentially going through the map, ranting about some things that I noticed and caught out that I might adjust or maybe rethink how to rework. Also, some suggestions in there because I know there was some interest in routing and stuff. First things first, as always, nitpicking spawn for no reason. Side-facing spawns means you do have to do awkward turns as you leave spawn. It's not a huge deal, and I understand the reason this back area exists is to break the sightline, but I also think it's fine to just have players spawning forward. This side-facing spawn is going to cause some awkward, I would say, variations in directions people come out from. Besides that, I'm quite happy with most of the spawn doors. I think there definitely is a gravitation towards the left, and I think a large part of that is the right area not really leading to a ground that you can then push further off. I'll elaborate on that in a bit. But first, let me move some. There we go. Hopefully, it won't be annoying and buzzing. Okay, so let me think what I want to rant about first. Maybe one of the biggest challenges making a payload map is you have this big object here, the cart, and it has to run this track throughout the entire map, and you need cart clearance on both sides of that. So I saw a comment that one of the things you were struggling with a lot is spacing. I think that really goes to show, like in this area in particular, you can see the cart having enough room to breathe is kind of violated. Your cart is really squeezing in between the spaces, and it really hurts in terms of feeling comfortable in these places. Like, I definitely think this is a very uncomfortable place to play in, and there's also isn't that many rotation options from this place. So the left flank here is quite disconnected. I was surprised how awkward the rotation is. Normally, if you make an awkward rotation that you have to go back for, so if I'm there, I realize there's too much spam on to rotate. If I come back here, doing prop jumps after already retreating is slightly awkward. I also think this is actually in a sightline, which is all the way back there, but I have a suggestion for that later. And rotating all the way around this way takes quite a long time. And I think, oh god, this is so chaotically disorganized. One of the big troubles, my thoughts, not the map. One of the big troubles with flanks, you really want flanks to funnel back into the main choke. So I'm going to go a little bit off track here, but I think one of the big problems with this map is that you can flank quite far behind without ever interacting with the main track. So as a sort of like principle theory, we'll call it, right? If you want to prevent people from being able to flank behind very far and it to feel very awkward, you need to have this sort of hourglass design where people rolling out at some sort of checkpoint can see or have a general idea of what's going on in the other routes. So if someone's trying to sneak behind, they actually have to actively try to sneak behind. On this map in particular, if I look where red hold is never going to be further forward than there and here, just logically, right? The one-way gate means you're always really close to pressuring a red hold there, so that they won't have a stronghold there, right? Most of red doesn't want to hold so far back they go on the platform, so they're kind of loitering, I'd say, in that gameplay space after they get pushed back initially, right? But then if you look at this wrap route, for starters, the only people who are going to be fighting you are people who go through that choke, and there's can be tons of players underneath you, tons of players over there, but they don't really do anything until you're ready pretty much at this door on top of the, I would say this is kind of like comfortable red main hold spot. And what defines, I would say, an instinctive red hold is the space to kind of hold where it is and proximity to the point. In particular, this point design, I like to call it kind of like gorge last, where the idea is you have an objective underneath you. You don't really hold the objective by standing on it. You hold it with better positioning. But you have to give up the better positioning often to fight players who are contesting the objective, and then that kind of results in the snowball effect while your attackers are just focusing on killing those players around the point. Defenders have to give up their position, have to sacrifice, jump in, throw the bodies on the pile. But the problem with like having or trying to have a main fold here is, I would say, the distance to the back wall, right? In particular, that back wall is a little bit over the distance most classes can fight, like reasonably. Like this is already kind of, you have to start to charge your sticky range as the demo man, which is quite awkward. I think one of the big changes I'd make is to try to tuck that corner in to bring in the distance of combat. Another thing that I was noting is that there is some very long sight lines, either across. I know there was some attempt to fix those with the walls, but I think it kind of goes both ways. even through props. And most of the time, some of the props, if they aren't very strict, you kind of just end up with a little bit of like sniper cover. In particular, I remember looking down here and I was like, oh, okay, the box fixes it. And then you just go up this little slope, and now you have the perfect view all the way here to the cart track to the main spawn, so nobody can cross that safely. So that's why I was saying this area is a little bit awkward. I feel bad kind of just spewing my chaotic thoughts here. But yeah, I think, to summarize, this flank route goes too far behind without wrapping back into the main sooner or having a better visualization from main. Because most people underneath will never know these players are above and behind them until they drop down like this, or they kill everyone up top and then fire backwards at their back. So there's no real central clear red main hold, because if it was here, you're rotating to hold this kind of awkward spot, and you would need to rotate really far forward to hold these doors. So this door is always given for free. In terms of the main choke, I think it's quite uninstinctive that you have two routes up to that left flank that are both kind of, they do the same thing. They're like in the main choke and very aggressive. And I also think what's probably worse is if you're a defender, like sitting here, you think this is pretty comfortable. That's a cliff, right? So they can only approach from one direction, and then a player can just pop up at either of these two locations, because the staircase isn't really well illustrated, I'd say. I wish I had a better recommendation for a fix on that. I feel like this could be a gameplay rotate space, this like chicken wire fenced area, but I hesitate to offer like a clear solution yet. One-way shutters, I think they have to be used sparingly. I think this was, I'll talk about this a little bit, but essentially you have the main cart track, right? And then you have the inner circle, which is generally like players spawn and fight that most frequently. And then you have the outer circle. The outer circle is like the less active flank that gives positioning. And this will come into play more when I try to talk about the second point. But for this area in particular, the inner circle having this choke door means blue gets everything up to this for free. And then I would say they get everything within roughly, I would say, half an Uber's distance for free, just given, occasional Ubers and pressure and other routes. So this, you would expect there to be a lot more combat, but the geometry ends up being very awkward because there's a lot of inset corners, I'd say, where players did not really feel comfortable pushing. So I think I have a good example of that. Like here, corners like this make very little sense to me. I'm hoping they aren't designed as like spy decloak spots. You really don't need to design for and around that. It will make people feel a lot more comfortable pushing through spaces if you don't have corners that players can hide in. Like, I don't instinctively think there should be any room for another player there. And the same kind of goes for some other spaces that I will think about when I'll point them out when I see them. That was a bit about flow. The idea behind this point, essentially when you cap it, having this low escalator makes sense up until most of the players don't want to be in the pit pushing the cart, so they'll rotate it on the high ground, and the point will be capped behind them, so have this sort of like delayed representation, which is going to affect the second point significantly. I also think you have to consider, this is one of the things you have to be very careful about, if you have a long delay for a point, say a point caps really slowly, like on Mountain Lab or something, right? One of the pub events that you see is happening, that's quite amusing, is blue team spends such a long time capping that red team ends up overextending, like trying to expect there to be combat. They go forward until there's combat, and then they set up. They'll set up somewhere that makes no sense, or like half the team will go feed into blue team, which is just sitting around waiting for a point to cap, so they're nice and big and deathballed. So slow point cap also means large blue deathball, some red team players feed, and then you can have this big deathball momentum push wave together. So be a little bit careful trying to use a delay mechanic. It doesn't always favor the defending team, I would say, in pub play that is. Besides that, did I have a suggestion for an area? I did actually, one of the things I did notice in the playtesting is one of the reasons the second point was slightly hard to push is once red team manages to establish this kind of forward hold, I'll call it a forward hold because it's ahead of the point, it's very difficult for blue to do anything against a position like this where you're entrenched because it's very hard to dislodge them. They have pack there, I'll show it, pack there, pack here, and high ground and like reasonable cover. And you would never really cross this, you can't really fight from crossing that, and it's too far. So really, you only have to worry about the players who are already underneath you, that you have high ground, you can always dunk around a corner and be safe on, and then play these corners. I think enabling the outside rotation to be a little bit better might help, but I don't like it being this far away. So I might recommend just having this area essentially move forward here, and then you have, we'll call it a blue deck here, and this blue deck kind of opposes the high ground, and it kind of ensures that there's enough space to take, like, I would say, this courtyard area. So that was just one brief kind of like thought I had. Besides that, for this next point, I already mentioned that it's kind of like forward hold. I think that's the primary hold you should focus on. I'll talk about intentional gameplay in a little bit, but this clipping is always a little bit awkward if you're trying to like back away and look across here. I had a little bit of a annoyance with this lighting because I thought there was a... I instinctively think there's another route here, even though I know it doesn't make any sense because that's back towards my spawn. But you see how I don't feel comfortable with knowing that corner is kind of like clear? Just from like this angle, especially with this lighting, drawing my eyes kind of like central focus. Besides that, this area reminds me a lot of Barn Blitz. Barn Blitz second is what I want to say. Second transitioning into third. Because there's kind of like this left tunnel route, and then there's kind of like the hard to push main, and then an inside tunnel route that doesn't really translate well, but I'm going a little bit ahead of myself. This really deep blue flank, I want to talk about flanks briefly, because essentially this is a flank that avoids all the main combat, all the main sight line, is quite exposed, and ends up wrapping behind. Now, this is exactly where I wanted to talk about the inner circle, outer circle thing. As you can see, this is the main card track. This is the outer circle. You want it to be give you some main high ground that helps the attacking team dislodge the players blocking the main, right? And even though this is the main, I'd say this is kind of like the main hold. And then you have the inner circle where there's generally a lot of tension going on, and it's usually the most claustrophobic and spammy. So you do kind of have part of that formula. But then the question is really, if I'm up here, do I have the ability to dislodge those players? From here, not really. It's a little bit too far, and the only thing I have is a small health pack. They're kind of indoors, and I can't really cut off the players rolling out very well. We fight on equal ground. They can always shove me back. If I get shoved back as an attacker, this is a very nasty position to be in, because I'm not in control of the aggression anymore. They can always peek forward, attack, and I can't do anything about that. So I would recommend probably enabling this to be more of a deck to overlook this ground here. So if I, as a flanker, manage to infiltrate here, I can really start harassing these players, trapping them so that my team can collapse on them. That could mean exposing these players in terms of like their back to that area, so now they have to actually turn around and fight. Now that they're being harassed by those players, these players can come in and take the space and kind of like pinch them together, you see? So these areas are very comfortable for a defender because I can only be attacked by one direction. I have a geometric wall blocking me. If it was more exposed the other way, you can see these players can now assist the players who are just attacking normally on the inner circle. So that's kind of what I mean by accidental teamwork in TF2. But I did mention, I think one of the big things to consider is how you want this point to be held. Because with the forward hold that I kind of visualize, which is kind of red loitering in this area, I don't think the point should be all the way over here. This is a very aggressive point to cap because the spawn is right here and you just drop down right across or drop down over. I think it's very awkward. But the attacking team will never have control of this drop down. Like, they'll never have a person positioned here unless they like rocket jump or something, and it's that close to their spawn. So this point is basically one through spawn camping, which isn't uncommon, usually more for lasts, but I think it might be better if instead you have this sort of like tension over the main door, and then this route being the main one that can like push or pressure the card, but not as awkwardly. Because you see, if I'm an attacker, I have to like wrap around, and I have to make sure there's enough space for this, because it's also one of the things that helps enable the push afterwards. I definitely think the transition into this space could be smoother, and you can even bring out the wall, I'd say, here across. Oh, too close to the spawn. You can bring out the wall here across. I was very careful to try to see if you could get sniped either or, but I do think it's pretty okay for you to just bring it forward, to bring this straight across, like that, and then this is why I said it reminded me of Morio, because essentially when you cap, either there or here, you want it to be easier to take the next space, and currently you accomplish that by making the spawn there, which is, I would say, very aggressive, because then it's just like the spawn wave is the thing that pushes through, not the geometry. The geometry, it's still very difficult to fight down a slope, especially with a wall like this, because if you think, if I'm an attacker walking forward, right, and they're defending entrenched in place, the first thing they're going to see is your feet, and then they have an extra maybe second and a second and a half to pre-fire, to shoot, because they're firing from their head, while you still don't even see the enemy. You're like walking down, you have head height, right, and you're going to get to about the level you'd actually see the player, and the rocket's already going to be in your face. So it's just very disadvantageous to walk down a slope and fight. I do think this flank route, which I assume opens once speed caps, I've never really gone here, is kind of like really windy and really awkward. I can't imagine myself ever coming in through that way. I definitely think it's the kind of route that complicates the geometry, enables red team to kind of like rotate in, weirdly enough, where where was it? Here, I do think as part of a rollout, especially when blue works out more space, only enabling them to see the red player flanking from these doorways is problematic. And this is what I mean where the hourglass design. Just keep in mind, I mean, you know this obviously. Your attacking team is spawning here through this shutter, right? The two routes they're going to gravitate towards is this way, which I think should be cleaner if it's going to be one of your main rollout directions, and main, right? So what are the routes that aren't covered? This way, which is the attacking side's outer circle, which happens to be the defending team's inner circle. So if I was a flanker, I'm intentionally trying to go behind without encountering people. I can avoid the main cart track, and because most of the players are drawn to that side, I have a very easy time as a flanker getting behind, beginning to harass people, and all I need to do is just have the right timing, and now I'm completely behind. Now I have health pack, and I'm camping their spawn. So and this is already a position where it's very easy to like rotate back into health pack, into health pack, into health pack there, right? So this is kind of, you enable the flank to go behind by not having the way behind feed back into the respawn. This is pretty much the only contesting area. You would never really check that way, and even rollouting this way is very awkward because of how much high ground there is. If there's any players you're expecting to fight, you're gonna be let down by the number of like high ground areas they can retreat back to. But in terms of this is mainly transitional space, nothing too remarkable besides that. Airspace violation. Besides that, I think this goes out a little bit too far. I'd be fine like bring it in, chicken wire there, packs there. It being super inset makes it a really long rotation and makes it very exposed. Areas like the main sightline and across. I have a couple of adjustments I'd recommend for this area, and I'm trying to think how to go about it first. First, I mentioned as an instinct, I want to reverse the direction of this catwalk. So imagine like this ramp placed here-ish. I can't really draw it out very well, but the idea being currently it's very easy to duck down here, get this full health pack, continuously fight the choke, get this full medium health pack, fight this choke. Packs like these, when you defensive team owns the choke, just assists the defender in continuously applying pressure, right? And even the geometry, it's useful for the defending team to retreat to break a sightline, but it's not useful for the attacking team because they don't really need to link to this direction. If there was like some level of separate high ground here, you can diffuse spam from the choke, you can attract fire away from what should be a major area. And you can get some sightlines across, make it harder for players directly underneath you to fight you. Where here, you can be collapsed on very easily. And by reversing that geometry, you also, I would say, help enable the players who are in here to win some space for your team. So ideally, the players who decide to go up this way into the window, which you need to be careful about clipping in tight spaces like this, because it's very easy when you're trying to get an angle to like back into these, avoiding pills. Drops like these are also very awkward and in the way. But ideally, you want these players to not get sniped from there. Shouldn't really have an overlooking of the entire point. I would like cut this off. They really just need to win a small area. The small area being there, right? And then the team that's pushing main, once they manage to have that owned, they don't need to worry about a player right here next to the door spamming them. They try to move forward. They can take this space. From this space, they kind of own that space forward here. Now it's much harder for those players in the window to get harassed because there's the players in front and center bothering them. So now these players can start to begin to rotate in, and you have this kind of leapfrog mentality where your flank helps your main helps your flank, and the attacking team slowly progresses like that. I already mentioned adjusting health packs. That would also be something that you can move so that attackers actually own the health packs once they push in, because currently this is a very defender favorite health pack. Ask me if you don't understand what I mean by that. But I think the other thing that makes this point really awkward to hold is actually where you've positioned the spawn. So you have to think about instinctive rollout behavior. I'm a defending player, right? How am I going to rotate out? I'm going to walk out, okay, assuming I see the giant arrow, I'm going to walk out this way, and then I see another giant arrow. And pay attention to this, right? Because I actually think your main cart track should be your main focused rollout, but instead it's this way. So if I rotate this way, now I'm immediately on high ground to the flank and on high ground to this flank as well, I'd say, because that's the main cart track, right? So your main route leads to 2 high grounds over the flanks, right? That's why I was playing Medic, I remember in one of the playtests. I was playing here. I was like, I expect some of my teammates to roll out so I can buff and heal them. And I sat here for like 30 seconds and none of my team rolled out this way because they're all rolling out that way. And I think that's problematic for both the hold, where if you want red team's primary hold to be up here instead of down here, it's probably fine. But I think having all the red players up high on these catwalks in this awkward geometry and having the space down here feel so empty is very awkward to me. I instead would want the red main hold to be behind this kind of piece of cover you made with a little bit of rotation and a little bit of like flank interaction. So the geometry change I'd recommend besides that ramp would be actually to seal, I want to say seal off this room, but not completely. So we'll say we'll just cross it across there. And now the main rollout still exists on the cart track. Go see the cart track, they follow it. This door still exists, and you can rotate up here, right? So everything still stays the same there. And then I also think as a player here, if I want to get to that top catwalk, there's no way I can go through the main choke. So I want a defensive way to rotate there. There's a lacking door here, I'd say, because rotating back like this is very awkward. So if this space, kind of like directly here, fed into a staircase up, because this door is now closed like that, it's a bit of a U-turn, but at least now you have an investment into rotating to the high ground. And you can always go there as a defender by giving up space. So I mentioned that's an attacker favorite pack. One of the things you want is players who are weak and don't have a medic need to relieve pressure from the choke. The way you do that is by having health packs exactly like this, that are further back, that are against walls like this, or in staircases so that they go all the way back, and then they can come and apply pressure, and it's not a constant, relentless horde on the choke. In terms of this flank interaction, I actually think it's completely fine to give the attackers a kind of bone. It is weird to me that the defensive main rollout, I was wondering why this choke was so hard to push, the defensive main rollout ends up with high ground over the doorway. And yeah, these railings are super awkward. I would just connect them. You have to be very careful. Any mobile class, like imagine you're a scout trying to move around here, I can't make that jump actually just because of the haste power up. It's going to feel very awkward collecting these health packs. I didn't mention this earlier, but I also think you should avoid having health packs in combat space. So this isn't really, I'd say, directly combat space, but it's a little bit degenerate combat if you're fighting someone and they can accidentally pick up a health pack. That's the way I describe it. You want to avoid kind of having that accidental behavior, is what I'd say, where they should be something you have to deliberately go out of your way to collect. But yeah, I think those changes are the kind of like light ones I'd recommend. Besides that, moving on to the next point, this is one of the main things where one of the things I do is as soon as the point caps, I assume you respawn your attacking team. Simulate a walking behavior from both sides and see where the middle point where you meet up is. That's where you should expect the first kind of like combat to happen. And I think this last is very deceptive in that it feels like there should be a hold here. I think I mentioned that. Where you can see there's packs there, but there's like a beautiful open space here. This looks perfect for engineer buildings, but obviously anyone who gets to this wall can just come over and destroy those. It's a horrible place for a building. This flank also leads directly, this door opens directly above this. It's a horribly exposed pit that you think you can hold in, a little bit like Borneo style. So instead, really, realistically, the defensive team can't really pass beyond this point. Unlike Borneo, there's no forward hold outside of the last. And I think that's very awkward because you're essentially boxed in here and you can never take space. Because even if I completely wipe the defending team, moving out here would only be asking for death. Where if you think Borneo, you can push outside of the last and there's like an intermediary hold that you can kind of take. I would try to enable that just to give the defensive team a little more leeway. Because currently, if that hold is lost, it's also just like a roll to last. And a lot of teams will try to push out if they have any advantage because it looks instinctively appealing, I'd say. Besides that, the geometry or here on last is just a little bit awkward. I'd say this pillar is quite confusing. Understands to block the sightline, but I'd make the route more defined. Almost the same thing with the inside corners. I almost think you could completely copy Borneo, sorry, where you have a pillar with a side route, and then you have actual dedicated route that leads to the spawn door. But the question is, does that actually add anything? Because the geometry looks like it's to help enable an attacker to like rotate in, but there's a lot of cut off sight lines in Borneo by having these like sharp angles. Here, there's still just kind of like sightline across all the way straight from spawn. So maybe I would say play with the angles and consider having like an actual inset into here. I don't think you have anything besides your detail. Besides that, I think that's a cool set piece. I think this left side, having this entire overlook is interesting to me because as far as I know, this is kind of like a big gulf. It's quite difficult to cross it and they aren't very connected. So like if the attacking team's here and the defensive team's over there, this is quite a long rollout and the tunnel is quite easy to shut down just by like spamming, right? It's quite difficult to fight out that choke once you have this space. And then the defending team really can't, because the cart's a piece of cover, they have to commit over the cart somehow in a very awkward way. So it's a very hard last to actually defend, even if it went much further or the rollback was more significant. It's very hard to sacrifice yourself given the distance and scale and how easily they can fortify one side. When you have a last like this, as long as you fortify one side, you're kind of won. If you think like upward, the attacking team fortifies one side, the defensive team has like this huge overlook to try to help spam onto the cart. Your map doesn't have that, it just has one side and the other side is just very easy to push. Maybe a little bit more like, is it snowplow? God, I can't remember my maps right now. Um, but I think it's a relatively easy last to push because you actually do have to simultaneously own both sides rather than even the attacking team even temporarily like taking any holding ground or space. And this left spawn I think is quite disadvantageous to push out because of this long exposed sight line, long rotate, and no room to dodge in this kind of like tighter tunnel. But overall, I think I enjoy the gameplay a lot. I hope my feedback doesn't indicate anything otherwise. I think the few geometric things I think are logical, and I'm really excited to see where the map kind of goes. In terms of like my suggestions for fixes and just like random thoughts, they are pretty much that, just random thoughts. Don't feel urged to commit to any of them or make any changes unless you're rather convinced that it seems like a good idea. If you don't understand anything I talked about, I did talk pretty quick and I'm kind of just spewing everything randomly. Feel free to send me a message and we can talk more online about live, person to person about some of the thoughts I had because there's a lot of random gibberish that I kind of spewed. I walked around the map for about like an hour and a half trying to collect my thoughts, and clearly it didn't help. So this is about 30 minutes long. I'm going to call it there. But like I said, really cool map. I hope you continue to work on it, and I think it definitely has a lot of potential.